Okay, everyone. Today's lesson is on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, one could debate when did the Cuban Missile Crisis started, but for the purpose of this lesson, let's agree that it started on 16 October and ended on 28 October 1962. What is the Cuban Missile Crisis? In short, it started because the Americans discovered Soviet missiles in Cuba, and as you can see in the map, Cuba is an island that is not far away from America, and that caused a panic in America. So, what do you need to know regarding the Cuban Missile Crisis? Firstly, how the tensions between Cuba and America led to the crisis, and what happened during the crisis and how it ended. For the purpose of this lesson, you will learn how the tensions between Cuba and USA led to the crisis. To understand this chapter, well, you need to know two things. Firstly, what is the Cold War? Because the crisis happened in the context of the Cold War. And secondly, what happened between USA and Cuba, leading to worsening relationship that led to the crisis. Okay, what is the Cold War? This is a recap. It is a pure tension, geopolitical, ideological, economic, military rivalry between USA and the Soviet Union, as well as their respective allies after World War II. It is a period in which America and the Soviet Union are extremely suspicious of one another, as well as what they deem as the allies of their opposite, okay, the allies of their enemy. Okay, development between USA and Cuba. Well, this development, this relationship, the source of the tension goes far down in history before 1962. Well, basically, as some background information, you need to know that USA or Cuba is seen in the eyes of USA as a special island. But it's not just any island, it is an island that is near USA, is an island in Central and South America, an area in which USA see it as their sphere of influence. That what does that mean? Basically, USA see that they have the sole right to influence Central and South America. No other country has the right to influence their backyard. And Cuba lies within that sphere of influence. Again, that vision about USA having the sole right to influence Central and South America is known as the Monroe Doctrine. Now, you can see examples of USA practicing the Monroe Doctrine because USA has a history of influencing, interfering with Cuban affairs. For example, they participated in the Cuban War of Independence against Spain. The Americans set up a pro-US government in Cuba. Alright, the Americans also sought to safeguard their interests in Cuba, and unfortunately, that is seen as against Cuban interests because American economic interests, their companies, would benefit from Cuba, exploit their land, their manpower, but in return, provide very little for the Cuban people. That, of course, caused tension between many Cuban people and, America. Okay, now, as mentioned, US frequently interfered in Cuban politics. The US ambassador to Cuba is actually, a de facto governor, okay, whose advice was eagerly sought, all right, by Cuban leaders, all right. One example of U.S. Interference very close to the Cuban Missile Crisis is the unpopular Colonel Batista, who was a dictator between 1952 and 1959. He oppressed the people, and he has a very, very close relationship with USA to the extent that many would see that he is being supported by the Americans. The Americans was willing to support such a terrible leader because they were afraid that the opposition would be friendly to the Soviet. In other words, he is, to the American eye, a necessary ally. Alright, and it doesn't matter if he's oppressive, if he's a lousy leader, the Americans have to partner with this necessary ally. As a result, that created a lot of unhappiness among the Cuban people towards America. Now, Batista's oppressive rule led to increasing support to oust him as leader, which also means that there was increasing support for this person called Fidel Castro. You need to know him because he would ultimately replace Batista as a leader, as the leader of Cuba. Alright, Batista later lost a civil war against him and had to flee to America in 1959. Now, Castro, this strange and interesting person, you can see his picture here, did not immediately identify as communist, but he would develop a communist-like economic policy. He would also align himself and Cuba closer to the Soviet Union, and that created a lot of tension between Fidel Castro's Cuba and America. And this is important because that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, what did Castro do? Now, his economic policy is one in which definitely against American interests. Now, America has invested heavily in Cuba. They have sugar plantations, they have tobacco plantations, they have oil refineries in Cuba. Alright, and Batista is going to affect American operation of these industries and plantation. Firstly, Castro wants to get rid, break out of the Cuban sugar quota, and that is the amount and price of sugar that was set by America to be purchased for sale in America. Now, they want to get out of it. They want to sell sugar to other countries. One country that they hoped to sell or they wanted to sell was to the Soviet Union. Okay, so the Minister of Industry in Cairo contacted the Soviet embassy, and the Soviets willing to buy 500,000 tons of sugar. The Soviet also sent a trade exhibition to Cuba, and that resulted in Cuba and USSR agreement to barter more sugar for Soviet oil. Now, this increasingly close trade relation with the Soviet Union is seen by Americans as a sign that Cuba is aligning itself to the communists. Now, it's important to know that Castro didn't identify himself as communist, but he's a new guy. He is against their supported dictator, and he's acting really weirdly now, right? He's aligning himself with the Soviet Union. That would set a lot of alarm bells in America. Now, he will go beyond that, alright? He said to implement land reform laws. So a lot of the sugar and tobacco plantation owned by the Americans are nationalized and redistributed to poorer farmers. Alright, so all farms over 3,333 acres and all private estate over 1,000 acres, many of them are owned by Americans, are redistributed and run as communes by the state, by the Cuban government. Now, this sounds really, really similar to what communism is, right? Basically, is to hand over resources or to take resources from the rich into the hands of the government to be redistributed to the poor. Alright? It is almost like, what is it? The rapid industrialization, in which the government, right, or the collectivization, that would be the better word, collectivization of the Soviet Union, in which private owned lands are taken into the hands of the government to form collective farms. Right, to the Americans, well, this is a sign that, hey, Castro is communist. But to Castro, it is basically a means to fulfill his promises to the farmers who had supported him during the Civil War. But nevertheless, to the American eye, hey, this is classical communism. And then again, more alarm bells ring in Washington. Was still Castro formed a particular friendship with Khrushchev, right, the leader of the Soviet Union, when Castro visited New York to address the UN Assembly there. All right, he wanted to stay in Harlem. All right, which is a place in which a lot of African Americans were discriminated in America's state. All right, and Khrushchev visited him. And during this meeting, it seems that there is a strengthening of relation between Castro and Khrushchev. Okay, now beyond that, Castro also championed the rights of the African Americans, in his address to the United Nations. This is seen as extremely insulting to the Americans, especially the conservative Americans who do not want to grant increasing rights to the African Americans. So on one hand, he has insulted Americans there by talking about a sensitive topic. On the other hand, it seems like he has strengthened his relationship between him and Khrushchev. That increased the alarm bells in America. Okay, from here onwards, right, you can see that Castro's action doesn't make things easy in regards to the US and Cuban relations. All right, there was increasing tensions that is followed by increasing aggressive actions between the USA and Cuba. So US planned to use its dominance over the Cuban economy to force Castro to change his actions. All right, so in April 1960, US pressured its companies, such as oil companies such as Shell and Texaco, to not process Soviet oil. All right, what did Castro do in June 1960 as a response? He nationalized. He turned all these private companies into Cuban government companies. All right. In July 1960, U.S. reduced its sugar quota from 3 million to 700,000 tons to hurt Cuban sugar sale. What did he do? Right, China and USSR stepped in to purchase those sugar. In September 1960, Castro nationalized all American-owned banks, railway, ports, hotels, and cinemas. That is severely against American interests, and they saw that this is an act of war. Right, and in response, in November 1960, US placed an embargo on US export to Cuba except food and medicine. However, the US embargo is inefficient as the USSR stepped in and helped Cuba in its needs. Now, the response, the American response to Cuba is not just economic. It is also military. The Americans sought to invade Cuba and then replace Castro. All right. Obviously, Castro didn't yield to Americans' demand. As a result of his economic pressure, military action was seen as necessary. So there was a Bay of Pigs invasion developed by the CIA to overthrow Castro's government by trading Cuban exiles living in America. Unfortunately or fortunately, Castro knew about it, was prepared for the invasion, and the invading forces were suppressed within 2 days. Now, the Americans also sought to assassinate key Cuban leaders, including Castro, using the name Operation Mongoose. And the aim was also to create open revolt among the Cuban people and then overthrow the Castro's regime. So as you can see, there are a whole list of actions between USA and Cuba that led to deteriorating relationship between the two.